Two men, two monsters. Luis Alfredo Garavito, the beast of Colombia. Pedro Alonso Lopez, the monster of the Andes. One hunted boys, the other hunted girls, but both turned entire nations into fields of fear. Their crimes were not only against children, but against innocence itself. Proof that evil doesn't always hide in the dark. Sometimes it walks beside us in daylight. Tonight, we uncover how two ordinary men became legends of horror, and what their stories reveal about the fragile line between man and monster. Welcome to Red Dossier. Part 1. The Two Shadows of Colombia. 1999, in the heart of Colombia, authorities arrested Luis Alfredo Garavito Cubillos, a traveling salesman whose crimes redefined the very meaning of horror. He was later confirmed responsible for at least 193 murders of boys between the ages of 6 and 16. Across the Andes, another name had already haunted South America: Pedro Alonso Lopez, a drifter who confessed to killing more than 300 girls throughout Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. Both men emerged from the same landscape of poverty and civil conflict, yet each built his own pattern of destruction. At first glance, their stories seem similar. Two serial killers born in the 1950s, shaped by violence, targeting the most defenseless. But beneath the surface lies a sharp contrast. Garavito was methodical, organized, a manipulator who planned every encounter. Lopez was restless and impulsive, moving from town to town, acting on opportunity rather than calculation. Their paths would never cross, yet together they exposed the deepest fractures within Latin American society at the turn of the century. Garavito was born on January 25, 1957 in Genova, Quindío. His childhood was defined by abuse, neglect, and alcoholism within his family, conditions common in rural Colombia during the decades of internal conflict known as la violencia. As he grew older, the wounds of that environment became the blueprint of his violence. He traveled between provinces posing as a charity worker or teacher, luring boys with gifts or promises of education. Each abduction followed a grimly consistent pattern, a modus operandi so precise that investigators later labeled him an organized serial offender. Lopez, born October 8, 1948 in Tolima, shared the same roots of deprivation but followed a different trajectory. After leaving home at 8, he drifted across national borders, living among street children, sometimes joining petty criminals. His assaults began in Peru, expanded into Ecuador, and finally returned to Colombia. Witness accounts described him as unpredictable, sometimes affectionate toward his victims before the sudden eruption of violence. His confession to more than 300 murders shocked investigators, though only about 110 were verified by physical evidence. By the late 1990s, Colombia's judicial system faced enormous strain: narco-trafficking, guerrilla warfare, and a fragile prison infrastructure. Within this chaos, Garavito's long-concealed crimes surfaced almost by accident. In April 1999, police arrested him after a failed kidnapping attempt in Villavicencio. During interrogation, he listed, with chilling calm, the locations of the bodies. The court sentenced him to 1,853 years in prison, yet the law capped effective imprisonment at 40 years, reflecting Colombia's legal maximum at the time. Lopez's story diverged dramatically. Arrested in Ecuador in 1980, he received a 16-year sentence, served only 14, and was released in 1994. Ecuadorian authorities deported him to Colombia, where his later whereabouts became uncertain. Some reports suggest he was briefly detained and released again. Others claim he disappeared entirely. This legal inconsistency highlighted a regional gap: fragmented communication between national police forces and the absence of a unified criminal records system. Both men operated during decades when Latin America was torn by political violence and economic collapse. International attention focused largely on drug cartels, led by figures like Pablo Escobar and Felix Gallardo, leaving crimes against children in rural areas tragically under-investigated. Neither the Colombian government nor international agencies such as the DEA or the CIA paid sustained attention to internal serial crimes that lacked a narcotics link. The result was silence, an institutional blindness that allowed Garavito and Lopez to continue for years without detection. By the time Garavito died in 2023, his case had already reshaped Colombian child protection laws, inspiring reforms such as Law 1098 of 2006, known as the Código de la Infancia y la Adolescencia. Lopez, meanwhile, remains an enigma, a name on record, but a man lost in the fog of bureaucracy. Their existence raises an enduring question. How can two men born in the same nation, molded by similar traumas, diverge so completely in method yet converge in brutality? And more urgently, what does their legacy reveal about the societies that created them? Part 2. Background, method, and the mind behind the crimes. To understand the scale of their violence, one must first look beneath the statistics and into the psychological foundations of both men. Luis Garavito and Pedro Lopez were products of social neglect, yet their inner worlds developed along opposite lines of pathology. Garavito embodied organized psychopathy, a predator of control, ritual, and emotional detachment. Lopez, on the other hand, represented disorganized impulsivity, a man driven by compulsion and delusion, feeding off chaos rather than structure. Garavito's early environment was soaked in trauma. His father was an alcoholic who beat him daily, while his mother remained passive, accepting the violence as routine. He reported being sexually assaulted by a neighbor at the age of 8, an event that later became the psychological seed of his obsession. By adolescence, Garavito displayed traits consistent with antisocial personality disorder, superficial charm, manipulation, and lack of empathy. He worked as a street vendor and salesman, skills that later allowed him to blend in and approach victims without suspicion. He meticulously prepared each encounter, choosing isolated rural paths, carrying alcohol, rope, blades, and sometimes candles for what investigators described as ritualistic acts. Every killing followed a psychological pattern: seduction, domination, torture, and finally murder, each step reinforcing his sense of power over innocence. Psychiatrists who later examined him described his mental state as a cognitive predator, fully aware yet emotionally paralyzed. Pedro Lopez's background was no less brutal. His mother, a prostitute, expelled him from their home after catching him molesting his younger sister. Homeless from age 8, Lopez survived on theft and occasional help from missionaries. He was repeatedly assaulted by gangs and imprisoned in his teens for stealing a car. Inside prison, he was gang raped. In retaliation, he murdered 3 inmates, a formative act that, according to forensic psychologist Dr. Rodrigo Guerrero, crystallized his hatred toward humanity. From that point, Lopez's violence became a personal war against vulnerability itself. Where Garavito planned each crime like a hunter marking territory, Lopez moved like a storm. He traveled across borders during the 1970s and 1980s, targeting poor villages and indigenous communities where law enforcement was minimal. He lured young girls, usually between 9 and 12, with small gifts or promises of work. He strangled most victims immediately and left their bodies in ravines or open fields, showing little effort to hide the evidence. His confessions later helped Ecuadorian police recover over 100 bodies, a level of cooperation unheard of at the time. He explained his actions in almost mystical terms. "The devil told me to do it," a statement that, while shocking, revealed a disturbed but calculated awareness of his moral inversion. In comparing both killers, criminologists often note the difference in organization and intent. Garavito, classified as an organized sexual sadist, derived pleasure not just from killing, but from the anticipation and control of the process. His victims were nearly always male, reflecting a fixation rooted in his own childhood abuse. Lopez, however, showed disorganized homicidal compulsion, targeting females and acting on immediate opportunity. Where Garavito's crimes spanned roughly a decade, 1992 to 1999, and were geographically traceable, Lopez's spree stretched over 3 countries and more than 15 years, defying jurisdictional tracking. Both men reveal the catastrophic consequences of institutional neglect in South America during the late 20th century. At the time, Colombia's national police lacked centralized DNA databases, and Ecuador had no national missing child registry. Victims often came from impoverished families with no access to legal representation, leaving countless disappearances unrecorded. These administrative voids functioned as an open field for predators like Garavito and Lopez. Each downfall stemmed from an act of overconfidence. Garavito was captured after attempting to abduct a boy in Villavicencio. His victim escaped and identified him to authorities. Investigators later matched receipts, train tickets, and maps found in his bag to multiple crime scenes, a rare moment of forensic linkage in Colombia at the time. Lopez's arrest, nearly 2 decades earlier, occurred when a failed kidnapping in Ambato, Ecuador, drew attention from market vendors. Once in custody, he confessed in detail to hundreds of murders, often guiding police personally to burial sites. From a psychological perspective, both men displayed narcissistic exhibitionism even after capture. Garavito reportedly boasted about saving souls through his confessions, while Lopez insisted he was a missionary sent to punish sin. These statements point to the same core mechanism, a perverse need for recognition, a distorted mirror of power in societies that had once ignored them. In terms of measurable impact, Garavito's confirmed body count stands near 200 victims, though investigators estimate more than 300 in total. Lopez remains statistically more prolific, with verified cases around 110, yet self-reported totals exceeding 350. If even half his claims are true, Lopez remains among the deadliest serial killers in recorded history. Public reaction differed sharply. Garavito became a national symbol of evil within Colombia. His nickname, La Bestia, the Beast, entered public vocabulary and school safety campaigns. Lopez, known as El Monstruo de los Andes, faded into myth, partly due to his uncertain fate after release. Both names, however, represent the same societal failure. When poverty, trauma, and bureaucratic blindness intersect, monsters are not born, they are allowed to grow. Part 3. Legacy, Consequence, and Lessons from Two Monsters. When the dust settled and the horror became data, what remained were two names echoing through South American criminal history: Luis Alfredo Garavito Cubillos and Pedro Alonso López. Each became a mirror reflecting the extreme boundaries of human depravity and the structural weaknesses of the justice systems that failed to contain them. Yet, as experts often point out, understanding them is not about morbid fascination, but about tracing how individual pathology meets institutional collapse. In legal terms, their stories ended differently. Garavito was sentenced in Colombia in 1999, facing 1,853 years in prison, the longest cumulative sentence in Colombian history. However, because national law limits sentences to 40 years, he effectively faced a term far shorter than his crimes deserved. He later expressed remorse, though forensic psychiatrists identified his statements as pseudo-remorse, an intellectual acknowledgement without emotional empathy. Lopez, captured in 1980 and convicted in Ecuador in 1983, received a 16-year sentence, the maximum under Ecuadorian law at that time. He served 14 years, was declared rehabilitated, and transferred to Colombia, where he was briefly held, then released in 1998. As of 2024, his whereabouts remain unknown, his name occasionally resurfacing in unverified reports. Both cases exposed the fragility of South American criminal infrastructure in the late 20th century. Before DNA profiling and centralized missing person databases, killers like Garavito and Lopez exploited jurisdictional gaps between Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. Forensic evidence was fragmented, and police cooperation across borders was rare. Today, international task forces such as Interpol's Project Vic cite their cases as foundational lessons in the need for cross-border child protection protocols. From a psychological perspective, Garavito and Lopez illustrate two divergent models of serial violence. Garavito, the ritualized sadist, required control, premeditation, and domination. He displayed psychopathic cognition, emotionally detached yet highly organized, capable of simulating normality to achieve access. Lopez, in contrast, exhibited psychotic ideation, delusional, impulsive, and driven by compulsive repetition rather than structured desire. In numerical comparison, Lopez may have killed more, but Garavito demonstrated greater operational sophistication and awareness of risk. Criminologists like Dr. Esteban Rivera of the University of Bogotá summarize the distinction succinctly. Garavito represents the engineer of death, Lopez, the storm of it. Their crimes also prompted philosophical and ethical debate about justice and rehabilitation. Can a society truly reform an individual who annihilated hundreds of children? Should moral judgment rely on legal limitation or on collective protection? In Garavito's case, Public outrage grew when rumors emerged in 2021 that he might be eligible for early release due to good behavior and participation in educational programs. The backlash was immediate, leading to legislative discussions about creating life imprisonment or chemical castration for serial offenders, a topic still unresolved in Colombian law. Culturally, both figures became symbols of fear and failure. Schools across Colombia now include awareness programs teaching children not to follow strangers, programs directly inspired by Garavito's tactics. In Ecuador and Peru, Lopez's legend evolved into a ghost story told by parents to warn their children, turning a real monster into myth. But beneath the folklore lies an uncomfortable truth. Both men emerged from environments of neglect, abuse, and systemic corruption. They are not alien aberrations. They are products of what society ignored.